Welcome to another deep dive. Today, we're journeying back to an event that didn't just decimate a city, but profoundly reshaped the very foundations of philosophy, science, and even how humanity grapples with natural disasters. We're talking about the Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755, a catastrophe so immense its ripples are still felt, almost 3 centuries later? We've unearthed some incredible historical accounts, scientific analyses, and modern reflections to really try and understand its full transformative impact.
And what truly stands out about this particular event on November 1st, 1755, is that it became this huge turning point. It wasn't just, a natural disaster. It triggered a cultural, an intellectual, even a political earthquake across Europe. So our deep dive today is really to unpack this moment and discover the lessons it still holds for us.
Okay, so let's dive in. Let's go back to that fateful day, starting with the event itself. Picture Lisbon, it's All Saints' Day, 1755. The city's vibrant, its many churches are absolutely packed with worshipers. Then, sometime between 9:40 and 9:40 in the morning, everything just changes utterly.
Indeed. And this was no ordinary tremor, not by a long shot. Modern seismologists now estimate its magnitude was somewhere between 8.5 and 9.5 on the moment magnitude scale. That's a more accurate measure for these really massive events, though historically you often hear it referred to as maybe a 9 on the older Richter scale.
Right.
The epicenter was deep in the Atlantic, likely within the Gorge Bank region, which is a significant seismic fault system southwest of Lisbon.
Wow. That's just a staggering quake. And the intensity in Lisbon itself was, off the charts, rated X to XI on the Mercalli scale.
Yeah.
To put that in perspective for you, X means destroying, and XI is just catastrophic. Eyewitnesses reported the ground shaking violently for up to 2.5 minutes. Imagine that. Causing these enormous fissures, cracks in the ground that some people say you can still see traces of today. It's hard to even picture that level of sustained violence.
It really is. The city, particularly the low-lying Baixa area, was almost completely annihilated by just that initial seismic shock. The sheer power was immense. And we actually have these incredibly detailed first-person accounts, like from Padre Manuel Portal, a Jesuit priest. His meticulous descriptions of the earthquake and then life in Lisbon for months afterwards, they offer such invaluable insight into the human experience of it all.
But the earth shaking, that was just the beginning, wasn't it? This is where it gets even more horrifying, if that's possible. Many survivors, fleeing the crumbling buildings, they rushed down to the Tagus River, to the port area, only to see the sea dramatically pull back, receding, revealing this muddy seabed littered with shipwrecks.
That's right. A classic sign, unfortunately. Just tens of minutes after the earthquake, a massive tsunami struck. In Lisbon itself, the waves were estimated at a minimum of 6 meters high. That's about 20 feet, with some reports claiming well over 10 meters. They just surged over the port into the city center, penetrating maybe 250 meters inland, completely flooding whole neighborhoods like the Barrio de Espalo.
And it wasn't just a local Lisbon event, was it? I mean, along the Algarve coast, down south, the tsunami reportedly reached an absolutely astonishing 30 meters in places, wiping out coastal fortresses, homes.
Yeah.
Just gone.
What's truly staggering, scientifically speaking, is that this tectonic movement generated the largest tsunami ever recorded in the Atlantic Ocean. Its reach was genuinely global. It caused considerable damage and loss of life in North Africa, places like Safim, Agadir, Meknes, and it generated these unusual wave phenomena, they're called seiches, as far away as Finland.
Wow.
Across the Atlantic, its effects were felt in the Azores, Madeira, the Caribbean islands like Antigua and Barbados, and even along the Brazilian coast. It literally connected the entire Atlantic basin in this shared moment of terror.
So the earth had ravaged the city, the sea had then claimed its victims, and yet Lisbon's ordeal, it still wasn't over. It's almost like fate demanded this final, cruel blow, fires then ignited across the devastated landscape.
Indeed. Many sources tell us these fires were sparked by, everyday things. Kitchen hearths overturned, candles toppled in churches during the quake, and then tragically, also fires set deliberately by looters in the chaos afterwards. It actually raises an important historical question.
Yeah.
Which of the three, the quake, the tsunami, or the fire, caused the most destruction? An 18th century work, the Novo Atlas para Uso da Mocidade Portuguesa, came out in 1782, actually corrected a French author on this point. It explained that while the earthquake certainly initiated the destruction, it was the subsequent fires that ultimately consumed most buildings and pretty much everything inside them, leaving only the bare walls standing.
Like skeletons of buildings.
Exactly. And a particularly lamentable loss, one that scholars still mourn, was the Royal Library. It was famous for its ancient manuscripts, irreplaceable original documents. all lost.
Oh, that's just heartbreaking. The scale of human suffering is, well, it's hard to grasp. Estimates for deaths just in Lisbon range wildly, don't they? From maybe 10,000 up to, some say, 90,000.
That's right, the figures are very uncertain. And another 10,000 or so might have perished in Morocco. And physically, roughly 85% of Lisbon's structures, grand palaces, libraries, convents, churches, hospitals, utterly destroyed or damaged beyond repair.
It's hard enough to fathom the destruction just in Lisbon, but I'm genuinely curious, did this catastrophe just stay contained there, or did its effects, maybe not the shaking, but other effects, reach much further?
That's an excellent question, and the sources clearly show the ripple effect was truly global, even beyond the tsunami's direct reach. The Anais da Ilha Terceira, the Annals of Terceira Island, gives us this vivid account from the Azores way out in the Atlantic.
Okay.
On Terceira, at the exact same hours as the Lisbon quake, the sea did these dramatic, strange things. Water flooded low-lying southern areas, washing fish onto the land. In one place, Porto Judei, the sea apparently rose about 2.2 meters over 7 feet on the highest rocks there.
Incredible. What about other parts of the Azores?
Well, in Angra, the main town then, the sea surged right into the Praça dos Cosmes, a main square. Ships were left stranded high and dry as the water rushed out, only for this powerful return wave, the reflux, to sweep away customs house, walls, and boats. Even more dramatic, in Vila de Praia, after 3 really unusual tides, the sea almost completely dried up, exposing the seabed before this huge inundation came in and demolished 15 houses, including a chapel covering farmland and vineyards with sand.
It's unimaginable power.
And these accounts, they don't just show the physical power, they reveal the immediate human tragedy too. We read the names of specific people who died. Mateus Teixeira, Simão Machado, Evangelo. His body wasn't found for over a month. They also tell us about the cultural context, the immediate interpretation.
Yeah.
The Azorians, remember, they experienced the tsunami, but crucially, not the earthquake shaking itself.
Right.
So their immediate conclusion, this was, and I quote, punishment of divine justice against the depraved customs of men. It led instantly to desperate prayers, religious processions, a search for meaning in the face of something utterly inexplicable.
That's fascinating. Feeling the wave, but not the quake, must have been incredibly confusing, almost supernatural seeming.
Exactly.
So these first-hand accounts paint this vivid picture of the tsunami's raw power far away. But how did people back in Lisbon maybe make sense of such an unprecedented event compared to things they did remember? Did history offer any comfort, or did 1755 just feel completely off the scale?
Well, interestingly, the 1755 earthquake was so overwhelming, so devastating, that it largely erased the collective memory of an earlier, quite significant Lisbon earthquake that happened back in 1531.
Oh, I didn't know about that one.
Yes, and Joaquim José Moreira de Mendonça, a Portuguese historian writing just a few years later in 1758, he actually compared the two events in his Historia Universal dos Terremotos, a universal history of earthquakes. He noted some really interesting things.
Like what?
Like some buildings that fell in 1755 had actually survived the 1531 quake just fine. But conversely, other buildings that were maybe newer in 1531 and had proven resilient then, they collapsed completely in 1755. It really demonstrates how each earthquake has its own unique fingerprint, its own characteristics and impacts. And it also shows us that very human tendency to measure the present horror against past experiences.
The sheer devastation of 1755, though, it didn't just flatten buildings. It really shook the intellectual foundations of Europe, didn't it? The Gazeta de Lisboa newspaper captured it perfectly, declaring, "The first day of the current month will be memorable for all centuries." This wasn't just seen as a local disaster.
Oh, far from it. Its occurrence on All Saints' Day, a major religious holiday, leading to the destruction of so many packed churches that ignited these intense religious and philosophical debates right across Europe. For the 18th century mind, which was still deeply steeped in the idea of a benevolent, controlling God, this was a terrifying manifestation of divine wrath, or maybe divine indifference, that just defied easy explanation. It sparked a genuine crisis of faith for many.
And this crisis led to some incredibly controversial reactions. You mentioned the Chevalier de Oliveira earlier, a converted Protestant who published this provocative pamphlet in 1756.
Yes, de Oliveira. He controversially attributed the earthquake directly to divine wrath, but he didn't stop there. He explicitly pointed fingers at what he saw as the Catholic Church's failings, things like using Latin in services, the worship of religious images, and especially its support for the Inquisition and the persecution of Jews. He called these the origin of all evil.
Wow, that's incredibly provocative for the time.
Extremely. And this stance earned him a trial in absentia by the Portuguese Inquisition. It culminated in his effigy, a representation of him being publicly burned in Lisbon in 1761. It just vividly illustrates how politically charged and deeply divided the interpretation of such a disaster was back then. People weren't just debating God's motives, they were using the event to fight existing political and religious battles.
And this tragedy, it also had a profound impact on some of the biggest names of the Enlightenment, didn't it? People like Voltaire, Rousseau, Kant, how did they grapple with it?
They really did. Voltaire, for instance, he expressed just profound perplexity, deep doubt about the ideas of divine goodness and providence in the face of such indiscriminate destruction. His famous satirical novel, Candide, published just a few years later in 1759, famously features the Lisbon earthquake. It became this international bestseller and deeply influenced the European imagination, powerfully questioning those established Enlightenment ideas of optimism, of this being the best of all possible worlds.
But Rousseau, he offered a really different perspective, didn't he? He kind of shifted the blame, arguing that maybe it wasn't just nature or God, but human choices that made it so bad.
Exactly. Rousseau argued that the disaster was, at least in part, a social construct. It was influenced by human behavior, human choices. He provocatively suggested that if people hadn't built so many tall, densely packed houses, if they'd lived more dispersed in simpler, smaller dwellings, the devastation would have been far less severe. He was raising this really important, quite modern-sounding question about how our own actions, our urban planning, contribute to the impact of natural events.
And then there's Kant, Immanuel Kant. He was apparently utterly fascinated by the physical phenomenon itself. He collected all the information he could find and came up with a theory.
That's right. Kant was fascinated. He gathered accounts, news reports, everything he could lay his hands on. And he formulated a theory that earthquakes were caused by purely natural processes. Specifically, he thought it was the sudden displacement of vast underground caverns filled with hot gases. Now, that theory was later proven incorrect, of course.
Right.
But it was one of the very first systematic attempts to explain earthquakes scientifically through natural causes, rather than attributing them to supernatural forces or divine will. The philosopher Walter Benjamin, much later, actually considered Kant's work on this the true beginning of scientific geography in Germany, and you could argue the birth of seismology as a distinct field of inquiry. A huge intellectual leap.
So out of all this rubble, this physical destruction, and this intense philosophical debate, this remarkable effort at reconstruction and really innovation emerged, largely thanks to the leadership of one man, right? The Marquês de Pombal, Portugal's chief minister.
Absolutely. Pombal's response was, in many ways, a masterclass in effective, pragmatic political leadership during an almost unimaginable crisis. It really reflected the rise of the modern centralized state. When he was famously asked, what can we possibly do now? His reply was incredibly direct: bury the dead and feed the living. That powerful statement just perfectly synthesized his immediate no-nonsense priorities.
He didn't just manage the immediate chaos, though. He had this incredibly comprehensive plan for rebuilding, didn't he? Looking at everything from immediate relief to long-term urban design.
Precisely. His emergency actions were swift and decisive. Things like removing bodies quickly to prevent epidemics. They even resorted to sinking them in the Tagus estuary, weighted down, establishing emergency hospitals and distributing food for the thousands of survivors. Ensuring public safety was paramount. He used the military and set up swift courts to prevent looting, even employing exemplary public death penalties as a deterrent.
Tough measures.
Very tough. He also actively fought against superstition and panic-inducing rumors, trying to maintain some semblance of order. He mobilized financial resources through strict price controls and levied an extraordinary tax on imports to fund the relief and rebuilding. And importantly for the time, he coordinated international aid that started pouring in.
And for the actual rebuilding of the devastated areas, he brought in the top minds, engineers, and architects like General Manuel de Maya, the chief engineer of the kingdom.
Yes, Manuel de Maya played a crucial role. He submitted detailed reports as early as December 1755, just weeks after the quake, proposing a completely new, rationally planned, and structurally safer city for the ruined Baixa district. His recommendations were quite revolutionary for the 18th century.
Such as?
Things like strictly limiting the height of new buildings and making the streets significantly wider than they had been. The idea was twofold. Wider streets meant easier escape routes during any future event, and also less chance of streets becoming completely blocked by falling debris from buildings on both sides. Palmel also ordered this meticulous survey and registration of all the old streets, squares, and property boundaries in the damaged zone before clearing it to prevent endless legal disputes later on. Incredible foresight, really.
But perhaps the most famous, the most enduring engineering legacy from that rebuilding effort was the Gaiola Pombolina, the Pomboline cage. Can you tell us about that?
Ah, yes, the Pomboline cage. It was this really innovative anti-seismic structural system. Essentially, it's a robust but flexible timber frame, a wooden cage built inside the masonry walls of the new buildings. The idea was that this internal cage would provide extra strength and, crucially, flexibility. It could absorb and dissipate seismic energy, allowing the building to deform slightly, to flex, rather than just rigidly cracking and collapsing like the old masonry structures had.
So it's designed to bend, not break.
Exactly. And what's truly remarkable, absolutely pioneering for the time, is that they actually built full-scale models of these structures, these bays with the Pomboline cage inside, and then tested them. They had troops of soldiers marching in unison on the upper floors to simulate dynamic forces, to simulate earthquake shaking. These are widely considered some of the earliest seismic engineering experiments in history. A truly rational, scientific approach to building resilience, emerging directly from the disaster.
It certainly sounds revolutionary for the 18th century. What were the biggest hurdles Pombal faced trying to implement this really forward-thinking, science-based approach, especially when so much of society was still grappling with older, maybe more superstitious interpretations of the disaster?
Well, beyond the obvious, the sheer scale of the devastation, the immense logistical challenge of clearing rubble and rebuilding the biggest obstacles were often political and cultural. There was resistance from elements of the old nobility and the church, who resented Pombal's increasingly centralized power and his often anti-clerical stance. They saw his rational approach as perhaps usurping God's domain.
Right.
And then there was the lingering public fear and the deep-seated tendency towards superstitious interpretations. Convincing people to trust these new, untested building methods over traditional ones, especially after such a trauma, wouldn't have been easy. Overcoming those ingrained cultural and political challenges while simultaneously rebuilding a capital city from scratch was a truly monumental task.
Yet, amidst all this, Pombal also ordered that incredible nationwide inquiry you mentioned earlier, sending questionnaires to parishes all over Portugal.
Yes, that was another stroke of genius, really looking beyond just Lisbon. He sent questionnaires to every parish in the country, asking detailed questions. How long did the shaking last? How strong was it? What damage occurred? How many died? Did you notice any strange signs before the quake? How did animals behave? Did water levels in wells change? This systematic effort to gather objective, empirical data about a natural disaster across a whole country, it was unprecedented. It's widely considered the very birth of modern seismology as an observational science.
So here we are 269 years later, the Lisbon earthquake of 1755. It remains this powerful memory, a historical benchmark. But what does it all mean for us today, living in our world of advanced science and technology? Does it still hold lessons?
That's the critical question, isn't it? The sheer terror of 1755 definitely lingered for centuries. Even as late as 1909, during the Benavente earthquake, which was felt strongly in Lisbon, many people reportedly stayed outside their homes all night, terrified of a repeat of 1755. Thankfully, Lisbon hasn't experienced another truly major traumatic earthquake since then. There have been moderate ones, like in 1969, which sadly still caused 11 deaths, but nothing on that scale.
Yeah.
And this lack of recent major events, while obviously fortunate, can subtly erode societal preparedness. It can create a kind of dangerous complacency, a false sense of security.
So the memory is there, it's etched in the history books, in the city's layout even, but the direct, visceral experience is fading from living memory. That does raise some serious questions about how prepared Lisbon and maybe other vulnerable cities truly are for a similar event today.
Absolutely. We're now deep into the 21st century. And we really need to move beyond just remembering 1755 as a historical event. We have to proactively confront the real possibility of another major earthquake and tsunami striking the region, and seriously reflect on the best ways to protect our populations now. This is where modern risk management becomes absolutely essential.
Okay, that's a powerful shift in perspective. But in the 21st century, with all our advanced understanding, how exactly do we define and measure this risk you're talking about? What are the components we look at?
Well, simply put, risk, as we define it today in fields like engineering and planning, is a kind of multidimensional concept. It's basically the probability, the likelihood of a damaging event happening, multiplied by the severity of its consequences if it does happen.
Okay, likelihood times impact.
Exactly. And those consequences, usually measured in terms of human casualties and physical or economic damage, they depend heavily on two things: the assets that are exposed, people, buildings, infrastructure, and crucially, their vulnerability to the hazard. So we
Got
talk about physical vulnerability, how likely buildings are to collapse, social vulnerability, how susceptible people are due to age, poverty, etc., and economic vulnerability, the potential impact on the wider economy.
That makes perfect sense. So given that framework, can we predict earthquakes yet? Is that a tool in our modern arsenal for reducing risk?
The million-dollar question. Unfortunately, no. Reliable earthquake prediction, telling you exactly when and where a major quake will hit, is still beyond our current scientific capabilities, despite decades of research. Tsunami warning systems do exist now, which is a big step forward from 1755.
Right.
But if a major earthquake occurs very close to a large urban area like Lisbon, the warning time for the tsunami might only be minutes. Maybe not enough time for a truly effective evacuation of everyone in the inundation zone. So, controlling the occurrence of earthquakes, that's not in our hands. But controlling our vulnerability to them, that most definitely is. Or at least it should be.
So what are the modern tools and strategies we do have then, if prediction isn't one of them, for mitigating the impact of a future 1755-like event?
Well, the main instruments we rely on today are a combination of things. Advanced scientific research is key ongoing work in seismology to better understand the earthquake sources, and in seismic engineering to design more resilient structures. Then there's effective civil protection, having robust plans and resources for crisis management, for rescue and recovery after an event. Also crucial is intelligent land use planning, making sure we're not building critical facilities in the most hazardous zones, informed by integrated risk analysis. And of course, constantly improving building codes for new construction. And crucially, finding ways to rehabilitate and strengthen existing older buildings to reduce their physical vulnerability. And perhaps underpinning all of that is public preparedness and awareness, making sure people know the risks and know what to do. Thankfully, Portuguese scientific research in these areas is now at a very high level, and it directly supports decision-making, which is positive.
That sounds like a lot of progress, certainly compared to 1755. But Lisbon still has this huge stock of very old, beautiful buildings, doesn't it? That must present a unique and massive challenge.
It absolutely does. It's estimated that about 67%, so two-thirds, of Lisbon's current building stock actually predates the very first anti-seismic regulations, which only came into force in 1950.
Wow, two-thirds.
Yes. So while modern construction built to current codes is far, far better, the task of strengthening these older buildings, especially the historic heritage, but also just ordinary residential buildings and strategic structures like hospitals and schools, it's a massive, ongoing, and incredibly expensive challenge. It's often hampered by economic realities. The cost of comprehensively reinforcing all these older structures is currently seen by many as simply unaffordable, given the country's economic situation. It's a major vulnerability.
That's a really sobering thought. So if, hypothetically, a 1755-like earthquake were to happen today with modern Lisbon, what do the studies project the impact might actually look like?
Well, studies conducted by Portugal's National Civil Engineering Laboratory, LNEC, they've run these scenarios. They project that a repeat of the 1755 event today could result in somewhere between 17,000 and 27,000 fatalities.
Still a staggering number.
A huge number.
Yeah.
And the potential economic loss could be astronomical, potentially reaching 200% of Portugal's annual GDP. Compare that to the economic loss in 1755, which was estimated maybe 75% of the GDP, and still enormous, but potentially less crippling in relative terms than it could be today because our economy is so much more complex and interconnected.
Those numbers are stark. But surely on the positive side, we have much better emergency services now, better medical care, international cooperation.
Oh, absolutely. We definitely have significantly more powerful and effective civil protection systems today. Better rescue equipment, communication, coordination. Medical care is vastly superior. International cooperation and aid would mobilize much faster and more effectively. And importantly, our population is generally much better informed, less likely to descend into panic fueled by purely superstitious interpretations. These are certainly major positives that would hopefully significantly lessen the human toll and suffering compared to 1755.
Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. But what are the current vulnerabilities, the downsides, that still really concern the experts today, despite all this progress?
Well, the downsides are pretty significant, too. Firstly, we just have a much greater concentration of assets exposed, a far larger population living in the potentially affected areas, much more infrastructure, transport, energy, communications, huge economic value concentrated in one place. Secondly, Our modern society is incredibly complex and highly dependent on interconnected systems, energy grids, communication networks, supply chains. This makes us potentially less resilient to a major system-wide shock than perhaps a simpler, more agrarian society was. A failure in one system can cascade through others.
That's a really important point.
Yeah, and socially, we also have factors like a higher percentage of elderly people, often living alone, which increases social vulnerability.
Yeah.
And despite all the advances in understanding tsunami risk, the effectiveness of warnings and evacuations in densely occupied coastal areas like parts of the Algarve and the Lisbon waterfront remains a critical concern. Are the plans really robust enough? Will people react quickly enough? It's a very complex, constantly evolving equation of risk.
So the story of the Lisbon earthquake of 1755, it really forces us to confront our place in this volatile world. It sparked this incredible intellectual revolution, practical innovation in planning and engineering. It's just such a powerful reminder of how societies are forced to adapt and rebuild after trauma.
It really is. And it raises that ultimate difficult question. Taking everything into account, the hazards, our improved knowledge, our increased exposure, is the overall seismic risk for a place like Lisbon greater or lesser now than it was back in 1755?
While we've undoubtedly made huge strides in understanding the hazard and in developing ways to mitigate our vulnerabilities, it's genuinely uncertain if these improvements fully compensate for the extraordinary increase in concentrated exposure, more people, more buildings, more infrastructure, and the systemic complexity and potential fragility of our modern society. Plus, the exact number of victims in 1755 is still so uncertain, it makes a direct numerical comparison very difficult. But the potential for devastating losses, tragically, remains a very real threat.
This deep dive into the Lisbon earthquake, it really reminds us that some threats, these massive forces of nature, they're permanent. They're beyond our ultimate control. We have to learn to coexist with them. And the way we do that is by continuously striving to control what we can control. Our vulnerabilities, our preparedness, our collective response when disaster does strike.
And what's truly fascinating psychologically is that despite all the science, despite the historical memory, populations often develop what psychologists call positive illusions. It's a sort of defense mechanism, maybe a sense of detachment or resignation, perhaps even denial, when faced with these low probability but incredibly high impact events. It always seems like something that happens elsewhere or won't happen again soon.
Right, the "it won't happen to me" mindset.
Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial that authorities, scientists, planners, and frankly, each of us as individuals and communities proactively drive the necessary changes, invest in preparedness, build that culture of resilience before the next tragedy strikes, rather than waiting to be forced into action by devastation once again.
A truly thought-provoking journey through history, science, philosophy, and human resilience. Thank you so much for sharing your insights today. And thank you for joining us on the deep dive. Until next time, keep digging for knowledge.